Animals form a monophyletic group. That means that all animals stem from a singular ancestor. So what makes an animal an animal? Well, all animals are multicellular and heterotrophic. That means they can not make their own food, like plants. They have to exist by eating other things, be it a plant, fungi, protists, or even prokaryotes. And all animals can move under their own power. That is, unless they had a wee too much fun on Saturday night. And all animals except sponges have muscle cells and nerve cells. And sponges are a fairly strange group for that reason. However, you don't need to worry about cutting them in two because they won't really feel anything. Compared to the protist and fungi phylogenetics, animal phylogenetics is far more straightforward. Animals' closest living relative are protists known as Choanoflagellates, and they really look nothing like an animal. You can see a picture of one in the lower left-hand corner. Porifera are sponges that don't have any body symmetry and lack different tissue types. The next animals have radial symmetry, and they're known as the Cnidaria or the Ctenophora. And you know these as jellyfish or comb jellies. And these are the only groups of animals that have radial symmetry throughout their lifetimes and are sometimes lumped together in a grouping called radiata. Every other animal that you can think of is bilaterally symmetrical, and they have what's been called a tube within a tube design. And a worm is a great way to think about it. When we see a worm, we see that it's tube-shaped. The outer part of the body kind of looks like a slimy straw, and within that body cavity is yet another tube known as the gut. In essence, humans have the same body plan, with some minor alterations. We have our outer body, albeit with arms and legs, and within the body we have a sophisticated gut which we know is the digestive system. This is another example of a tube within a tube design. Choanoflagellates are protists and are considered to be the closest living relatives to animals. Choanoflagellates are unicellular, whereas all animals are multicellular. Their closest animal cousin is the sponge. Both of these organisms are sessile, meaning that they're physically attached to a substrate, like a rock or coral. And choanoflagellates feed by attaching themselves to a substrate and catching food particles moving through the water. In contrast, sponges are multicellular, and they feed with cells that structurally look a lot like choanoflagellates. In fact, they're called choanocytes. Where a choanoflagellate catches food particles in the open water, a sponge is shaped like a vessel in which water comes into it and the choanocytes capture food particles on the inside of the vessel. This allows for a more efficient capture of food particles, and it's the first tube within a tube design. In addition to being multicellular and heterotrophic, all animals have tissues. And tissues are specific groupings of cells that are integrated both in their structure and what they do, their function. For example, all animals except fungus, and sponges are just weird. Anyway, they all have epithelial tissues. These are a grouping of cells that cover the surface of a body of an organism or the cover of an organ. You might remember epithelial tissues from your studies with cellular interactions. Epithelial cells are held together with proteins connecting cells very tightly. In fact, these structures are called tight junctions. And tight junctions serve to create a waterproof barrier between tissues. Early in development, animals are known as embryos. And animal embryos differ in two main ways. And these ways determine the final outcome of the adult. The most primitive are known as diploblast. Diplo is Greek for two, blast is Greek for embryonic tissue layer. So these are two embryonic tissue layers, and they're also known as germ layers. The interior layer is called the endoderm, literally the inner skin, while the outer layer is the ectoderm, literally the outer skin. And triploblast, you guessed it, have three layers of embryonic tissues. It also has an inner endoderm and an outer ectoderm, but it also has a middle layer known as the mesoderm. Meso stands for middle, and so literally it translates to middle skin. Each of these germ layers develops into specific parts of the body. For example, the ectoderm eventually becomes the skin and fat tissues that encompass the body. whereas the endoderm develops into the digestive tract of animals. And this is true for both diploblast and triploblast. So, diploblasts are relatively simple organisms that are basically a skin with digestive system. Most animals you think about are triploblast, and this is where the mesoderm gives rise to all the other inner organs of an animal, that is, other than the digestive tract. So in humans, this includes organs like the heart, lungs, and even brain. Diploblasts include some of the most primitive animals, the cnidarians, which include jellyfish, corals, and sea anemones. And they also include the ctenophores, also known as the comb jellies. And as you can see, these animals really are nothing more than stomachs with skin. All the other animals that you can think of are triploblasts. All animals have a nervous system, except of course the sponges. Jellyfish and comb jellies have a nerve net. And a nerve net is nothing more than a simple nervous system consisting of an interconnected neurons but lack any brain or any other form of cephalization. This type of nervous system allows these organisms to respond to physical contact. This allows them to be able to detect food and other chemicals, but in a very rudimentary way. What I mean by this is the nerve net allows the animal to respond to its environment, but it has trouble alerting the animal to where the stimulus is coming from. For this reason, simple animals with nerve nets will typically respond in the same way to contact with an object regardless of where that contact occurs. All other animals have a centralized nervous system, known as cephalization. This system combines masses known as ganglia and tracts known as cords. Humans have one main ganglion, the brain, and messages are sent throughout our bodies through nerve cords. Some animals may have more than one ganglia. Animals have three basic body plans. They can either have no symmetry, asymmetrical, or they can have symmetry. Some sponges are asymmetrical and they have absolutely no symmetry. However, all other animals on Earth are either radially symmetrical or bilaterally symmetrical. Organisms that are radially symmetrical have more than one plane of symmetry, and they include the cnidarians, otherwise known as the jellyfish, and the ctenophores, the comb jelly. The advantage of being radially symmetrical versus asymmetrical is that you're equally likely to encounter food in any direction. However, nearly all the animals that we see on Animal Planet are bilaterally symmetrical. This means that these animals only have one line of symmetry. In other words, half of the body is a mirror image of the other, but only in one direction. And typically, bilateral animals tend to be long and slender. The biggest advantage of this is that bilateral organisms tend to interact with their environment at one end. This allowed a concentration of ganglia, which is known as cephalization. In this way, there is a concentration of sensing and feeding structures in what we know as the head. A primitive group of triploblastic animals are commonly known as flatworms, and they're acoelomates. This means that they don't have a coelom. A coelom is an additional opening in the mesoderm of a triploblastic organism, and it is a container filled with fluid and completely lined by the mesoderm. And the coelom can serve two main functions, either as a container for oxygen and nutrients, and they're also important in hydrostatic movement in organisms such as worms. Of all the bilaterally symmetrical animals, there's two main groups. They're either ones that have a coelom or ones that don't have a coelom. Most animals do have a coelom, including yourself. However, a more primitive design lacks a coelom, and the group is known as Acoelomorpha, which literally translates to a morphology without a coelom. And this group is broken up into two other groups, the protostomes and the deuterostomes. And these two groups differ in two different ways. In protostomes, the mouth develops before the anus, whereas in deuterostomes, the anus develops before the mouth. The second difference involves how the coelom forms. In protostomes, the mesoderms hollow out from the inside to form the coelom, whereas in deuterostomes, the mesoderms pinches off to form the coelom. Worms move by hydrostatic motion. This is due to the design of their body cavity. This is a cross-section of a worm. The outer portion of the worm is called its body wall, and in the middle is its gut. Muscles attach to the body wall, and between the muscles and the gut is the coelom. This fills with liquid and allows hydrostatic movement. Let's see how they move. Their bodies are filled with a fluid, and the muscles in the body contract and relax in a pattern that allows the fluid inside the coelom to move back and forth. In this way, worms can move. And if you've ever gone fishing, you know worms are wriggly, and the reason is because of how they contract and relax their muscles. They typically only contract one side of their body at a time. When this happens, the body bends because the fluid-filled cavity changes shape. Worms coordinate their muscles, moving fluid from one side of their body to another, allowing them to move forward. Protostomes have another major split within them. And one group grow by extending the size of their skeletons, like worms and mollusks. And this group must have been named by a very mean-spirited biologist. And their name is, I'm going to give it a try, Lophotrochozoa. However, the coelom was somehow lost in flatworms. This is another example of an unparsimonious evolutionary adaptation. And that same biologist must have named this group the Ecdysozoa, and they grow by shedding a tough exoskeleton in order that their soft bodies may expand. Insects are the best known of this group. One of the biggest advantages of cephalization is the organization of the sensory organs in a single area. In the heads of these animals, many organs have developed to analyze and react to different senses, like touch, smell, and taste. And one of the most important sensory organs for many animals is the eye. Here we can see living examples that demonstrate the evolution of the eye. Eyes began as a group of light-sensitive cells connected to a neuron, and these are known as eye spots and can be seen in animals such as the limpet. These structures can detect light and dark, but lack any real sophistication. Nautilus have a fluid-filled eye, but no lens. This allowed them to detect the direction of light and dark, and that was about it. A major development came when the lens came around. A lens is a densey, glassy, organic tissue that allows animals to focus light onto light-sensitive cells. This adaptation was the first to allow animals to see shapes. However, the shapes would appear very blurry by our standards because the lens isn't fixed. Also, it doesn't have the ability to move. The most sophisticated visual organ is the eye, and it has a lens that has the ability to change shape. This allows organisms such as the octopus and even humans to be able to focus on an object at one distance and then look at an object at a different distance and be able to refocus the lens. This is like what a camera does when autofocus is working. You'll see it zoom in and out until it finds the right focal point. The lens is physically changing shape in an autofocus lens in order to do this, and that's exactly what happens in our eyes. In the next slides, I'll discuss different feeding strategies. Many marine species are filter feeders, and in fact this is thought to be the first feeding strategy of animals. Most suspension feeders have gills that can filter food particles from the water. Sponges, corals, and clams all feed in this manner. And you might be surprised to learn that the largest organisms on Earth, the whales, eat some of the smallest, plankton. And they do so by filter feeding through a specialized organ known as a baleen. And it's really like a fine comb that takes out some of the plankton. And it's thought that the next feeding strategy to develop was deposit feeding. And this is when an organism eats its way through its substrate, like soil, and ingesting it and extracting food from within their gut, and depositing the rest of it as they move through it. This feeding type is common in soil, on land, or in the seafloor, and animals typically have very simple mouth parts, basically just an opening on both ends, and all of these organisms with this feeding strategy are worm-like, but not all necessarily are worms per se. Butterflies, hummingbirds, and flies are all fluid feeders. They eat by sopping up liquids, and many of them have piercing mouth parts so that they may puncture an outer layer so that they can get to the liquid innards of their food source. Flies do this. That's why a horsefly, whenever it bites you, it hurts. But the fly is actually just mopping up the blood with the tongue, and it needs to get through your skin in order to get to the blood. Humans are mass feeders. We take chunks of food into our mouth and digest them inside of a digestive system. Many animals are mass feeders as well, and the structure of their mouth parts correlates directly with the type of food that they eat. Mammals that feed on grass all have front teeth that nip the grass and molars in order to chew it before it goes into the stomach. Snails are also mass feeders, but they have a different approach. They scrape parts of the leaf off with a radula, and it's kind of like using a razor to remove hair in the shower. And reproduction in animals is highly variable. It can either be sexual or it can be asexual, where an organism simply buds off an existing organism. The polyp in the left picture is a great example of this. However, nearly all animals reproduce by sex. However, the act of fertilization can happen internally, as in the case of dragonflies, or even humans, or externally, as in some fish, or in this case, coral. And of the animals that fertilize internally, there are 3 different ways in which the embryo can develop. Humans are said to be viviparous. This means that females retain eggs within their body and give birth to live young. However, humans and mammals in general are an oddity. Most animals lay eggs outside of their bodies to develop. Birds do this, but so do reptiles, amphibians, and even fish. And this is known as oviparous. Some animals develop embryos in sort of a hybrid fashion. They retain their eggs after fertilization for a short time, and then they give birth to live young, but they're really undeveloped young. And later in development, they're fed yolk from outside the egg. These species are known as ovoviviparous animals, and they're similar to viviparous species in that there's an internal fertilization and that the young are born live, but they differ in that there is no placental connection, and the unborn young are nourished by egg yolk. Many insects have 3 different life forms. They start their lives out as larvae, which look completely different than adult form, and they typically eat completely different foods. Juveniles look and act a lot like adults, but they differ in the way that they're not sexually mature. Adults, however, are fully reproductive, meaning that they have the ability to produce offspring. The transition from one life form to another is known as its metamorphosis, and there's 2 different forms of metamorphosis. In hemimetabolos metamorphosis, the juvenile, known as the nymph, looks like a small version of the adult, as is the case with aphids. However, in holometabolous metamorphosis, the juvenile, known as the larvae, looks totally different than an adult. And the transition from larvae to adult occurs when the larvae encases itself inside a pupa, which then develop. Mosquitoes and butterflies go through holometabolosis metamorphosis. The remainder of these slides are a survey of the most primitive animal groups. The Porifera are also known as sponges and the most primitive animal groups that we know of. They're suspension feeders and reproduce almost completely asexually. Larvae are able to move around to find open substrates to grow, but much like a plant, once they begin to grow, they're committed to growing in a single location. Cnidaria are radially symmetrical diploblasts, and they have 3 distinct body types. They all start out as larvae and are able to move via jet propulsion. Some maintain the ability to move via jet propulsion, such as the jellyfish. Others, such as coral or sisal, this means that they're attached to a substrate. Once attached, they can reproduce asexually via polyps. Polyps are basically just buds of an animal that can grow into other adults. The jellyfish, as an adult, is a free-floating sexual organism, and it's known as the medusa. But don't worry about it, you can look at it without turning into stone. The Ctenophoras are a lesser-known group of organisms, which are also radially symmetrical diploblasts. And they're transparent and gelatinous like jellyfish, but they're not jellyfish. They eat plankton and are able to move by cilia, which is a comb-like row of hairs along the outer edge of its body. However, the Acoelomorpha may be the strangest group of organisms that I know about. They're a bilateral triploblastic animal, but they lack a coelom. So they represent the most primitive organisms that live today that have two important adaptations present in all other animals. They're bilateral and they're triploblastic. Most of them live in mud and sand and marine environments and also move by beating their cilia.